so much, Teeny, for that nice introduction. Thank you for the invitation to be here. I was delighted to receive the invitation and to speak to such a multidisciplinary audience about what is a multidisciplinary topic. As usual, I speak to lots of different audiences, as you might imagine. That might include emergency managers. Sometimes it's sort of straight computer science departments. Sometimes it's social science units of different flavors and things. And so I always find it a challenge, though I've been doing this work for a while, to figure out what should the narrative arc be through a talk for any given audience. So I find I sort of reinvent it every single time. So for this one, I have decided to go in the direction of surveying the field and trying to give you a sense of the multidisciplinarity of it. And so because there's been a broad amount of work done in this area, both by our group and increasingly other places, there's sufficient material to kind of breeze through it at a high level, and of course that's always at the cost of going in depth on some things. So what I'm trying to do is organize this area around 5 major branches that I think have been emergent from the work that's been done. I think there could be more branches and should be more branches of work, so it's not meant to be comprehensive of what we need to do in total, but rather kind of from almost a data-driven sort of description of where the field is today. So when I talk about these 5 branches, I'll be giving you sort of these illustrative moments and these kind of descriptions of the sorts of problems that we could tackle. And then in the Q&A, we can perhaps talk about more specifics about methods and things. But as you'll see, I hope you get a sense kind of going through this that a common thread that runs through the research is a real commitment to the sensibility of social cognition, even though I might not talk about it very much, and specifically distributed cognition, which brings me back to the early days of my undergraduate training at UCSD, where I was very, very influenced by that work. And so even though it might not be sort of an overt message over the whole of it, I think you'll see the kind of the sensibility coming through. So that is the goals for the talk that I have today. So just a bit of background about what we're doing at the University of Colorado. We have called, in a windowless lab, basement lab, what seems like a long time ago, we got a good-sized grant, and we were able to bring in lots of different students and faculty to start talking about this. And we said, we need a name to go with this and put up a web page. And so one of our students suggested this name because we were talking about the purpose of the grant was to start casting a light empirically on an understudied area of technology and emergency response, and that was the role that the members of the public play, and as we saw that role mediated through information and communication technology. And so this message of empowerment comes through, but I want to be clear that it's kind of an empowerment of a point of view rather than an empowerment of social media will save the day. We also, so it just nicely kind of mapped to this word epic, which had not yet become part of everyday language again as a slang word. And I realized when my kindergartner came home not too much later and started talking about his epic day and his epic lunch that we were in a little bit of trouble, because it suggests, I would like to suggest that we're much more humble than perhaps the name suggests, but the brand has stuck, and so the importance of naming things is actually a really critical one, which is perhaps lesson number 1 when you're working in an emergent area of research that you think has a lot of will have a lot of long-term potential. Be careful of your names. Anyway, I don't regret it, but that is the story behind it. So it's very multidisciplinary research. You will see in this, again, a kind of overlay of a real ethnographic commitment. Even when we're doing data science, we have a real ethnographic commitment to the socio-behavioral phenomena that underpin it. And sometimes we do kind of straight ethnography, as you would imagine, spending time in the field for sometimes long periods of time, or abbreviated versions of that, doing for short periods of time, doing qualitative work. And sometimes we're looking at social network models and having a much more quantitative view of it. But we always try to marry, because we're dealing with such large data sets, as you'll see, we still always try to marry that qualitative commitment in some way or another to the quantitative investigation of the bounds of the kind of data that we're looking at. So in addition to myself at Colorado Colorado. The other three major faculty members who play a role in this are Ken Anderson, and he is a software architecture and engineering researcher. And you might know Jim Martin and Martha Palmer, who are computational linguists. So if you come from that world, natural language processing and supervised machine learning, you might know a little bit about the work that they do. And then a lot of the, I should also say that our collaborator is Gloria Mark at the University of California, Irvine, who has taken this kind of in a direction of looking at war and protracted disaster, whereas we tend to look at hazards arising from agents that are exogenous or external to the thing that is being affected, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. So our PhD students, that's where a lot of our multidisciplinarity comes from. So we have people working in these various fields, HCI, information science, mass comm, linguistics, environmental science, and a lot of that is rooted in, you see it in their master's degrees or undergraduate degrees and their previous work histories. So they're really coming from different places to tackle this problem of crisis informatics, and so that means that we are moving in a number of different directions and trying to capitalize on the skills and sensibilities of the people who are affiliated with us. And that's why I think the 5 branches have been kind of a ground up sort of depiction of what it's about rather than some kind of top-down masterminding of the whole thing. So this is the working definition for now. So I define crisis informatics as the study of ICT, information and communication technology, in relation to actual or potential mass emergencies. So that takes into account those events where you're under threat and maybe the hurricane didn't hit your area, but you're acting in a protective way in anticipation of it. So actual or potential mass emergencies with a particular focus on the role of social computing in such situations. Now today's social media is one large class of social computing technology, and its advance has brought major attention to the nature of large social movements, which is one of the ways in which we see this space as a mass convergence kind of set of events. And so the social media aspects ends up being a focus of the research that we're focusing on at the University of Colorado Boulder. But really, social media is just one of many kind of one class of the social computing technology. And I really actually wrestled with this, what would seem like a very simple definition. And we chose social computing, one, because it's becoming a little bit more popular in terms of its use, say, with computer-supported cooperative work, which is a field that I closely associate with. But I like the gerund use, the computing use of it, because I think it speaks both to the technology as well as the behavior that is co-constructed with the technology. So it's both the technology and the behaviors that surround it when we think about social computing. Okay. So what are the five branches that I finally have worked out for at least this week? So here they are. I'll organize the talk for the remainder of the talk in this way. So first I'll talk about the impact of social media and other forms of social computing on emergency management. That's the most applied aspect of our work, and we're really committed to working with local emergency management. We have close ties with our state level emergency management and some federal as well. So we're looking at the issues that they face in terms of adopting both the technology and then reacting to the vast amount of information that is created in response to others adopting that technology. Another branch of research is kind of more data science-y, and it looks at the massive amounts of social media that are generated, the streams that are generated in response to disaster, which you might guess is hugely spikes. It's already a lot, but then it hugely spikes in response to different disaster events. If it's one that it's getting international attention, or even national attention, so say like Hurricane Sandy, the problem space is actually quite different than for localized disasters, because of course the whole world is looking on when something like Hurricane Sandy strikes the eastern seaboard. So I'll talk a little bit about what that problem space looks like. And then to be able to even look at those problems, we have a challenge in what I think of as sampling big crisis data. And it's interesting, the very collection of that data is itself a sampling decision. So even before you can sit down and say, okay, now that this event is over, I know the right research questions to ask, I'm going to start sampling my data, filtering it in some way to be able to ask that question, you might not be able to if you didn't collect it properly in the first place. And because the data are so ephemeral, this becomes a really big issue. So the collection and sampling are intertwined problems. And I'll talk about how we deal with that and where the challenges are there. Fourth is a set of studies that go to what I call the internal sociality of what's happening online, say in Twitter or say in Facebook, and certainly it can happen across those things, it does happen across those things. But the question is, when people are all converging online, just as they converge in physical space in disaster, what are they doing? I mean, because if you just open up your web browser and pull up Twitter, you probably just see what seems like a lot of noise, and it's hard to make sense of it. And in fact, I mean, that's a lot of it, but in fact, there are social structures that are underneath this that get realized through the communicative acts. And so we study the social structures that are within the online world around disaster response. And then finally, the fifth branch starts speaking back to the first one again, which is if you have people doing all this stuff online, and it's varied, what impact, if at all, does that have to the online action? So if people are trying to help by doing these information processing tasks online, does that save lives? Does that help mobilize resources? Like, what's the connection? Are they just keeping busy and worrying about things? Or is there something that connects to the online world and offline world? And this has been a major critique that we've been trying to respond to of crisis informatics, where people who critique the work will say, well, that's great that you know a lot about what's happening on Twitter, but so what? How does that connect to the emergency practice? And I say a couple things to that response. One thing is that if we were to look at that right now today, we might say, you know what, there's not a lot of connection. Does that mean there won't be a lot of connection in 5 years or next year? I think no. So it's not a question of proof, which I think is where people want us to go. I think instead the science here is a question of designing an intervention to see what that could be and making that happen. The other problem here is that there's a lot of connection between online and offline action, but it's so lightweight, right? It's ephemeral, it's transitory, it's passing. So the things that you and I might share might have some effect on the ground, but how can I see that? How can I capture that? How can I know that when I'm trying to study an area that's 800 square kilometers of effect or something? So to say that just because you can't see it doesn't mean that it's there it's a terrible, I think, inaccurate way of treating the science. But I think there's some additional stuff to say there that I'll address in just a bit. So those are the 5 branches. And before I go into each of them in more depth, I'd like to just kind of frame how we think about the field in relation to certainly a historical kind of reaction to what role social media should or could have in such important kinds of situations. So it wasn't even long ago. Some of this might feel obvious to you, but even just a couple of years ago, I always had to start out with this kind of argumentation, because I would be in a room, even with well-trained scientists, but from different disciplines, and I had a policy scientist stand up and say to me, you have to stop the informatics. You have to stop the informatics. I'm like, what? Stop the informatics? That's a research area. I'm not sure. And she meant stop the social media behavior that goes on in disasters. And once I knew that that's what she was saying, I thought, I'm not your person for that. And I don't think there's any person for that. So just the very idea that this is happening and the way we talk about it in our everyday language, through our everyday experience, is one that affects then how we think about the science of it. And even as a scientist of it, I feel guilty often of thinking about some of the mythical portrayals of disaster and having that influence the way I could think about it. So we're always kind of vigilant about this. So I'd like to start with this photo. Which is an oldie but goodie, and I can't quite let it go. But it shows how social computing and pervasive ICT is a disruptive force, right? So here, this is actually a photo of Obama when he was on the campaign trail in 2008, and I've cropped this photo because it's an enormous photo, but you can still see him here. And this whole crowd at this very one moment. And I'll zoom in for you, has some kind of device that they're doing to capture the event. And this was 2008, so we have digital cameras, right? If today we would have smartphones, right? Easy to imagine you've seen photos like this too. But I love this, this guy has a laptop here and appears to be doing video capture. So, I mean, so the need for video capture with our phones was apparent even then. So we see, what I like about this is because it shows a crowd, and we can see the sea of technology that represents the kind of data that it could mean if it could go somewhere, and it does go somewhere. So we can create content and we can share it. Lawrence Lessig talks about this as the remixing of content for different uses. And of course, we already know that this is highly disruptive to many traditional notions of institutions in our lives, and that includes emergency management. So the very idea of crisis informatics is a disruptive frame to those who think about emergency management and also those who design technology for emergency management. It disrupts the frame of reference, right? So, and we must be, as I said, vigilant about the existence of these mythical portrayals about how emergency management gets done if we're going to understand these large-scale socio-behavioral phenomena now mediated through technology as they occur there. So we must deal directly head-on with what I call the informal and formal seam. Seams represent division, but they also represent union, and what we do when we address social computing concerns, and indeed what I think we must do when we look at any new innovations for emergency management, is come to terms with the idea that organizations are necessarily comprised of formal and informal features to be functional. So now you're going to hear a little bit of my organizational behavior, a little bit of training I have on that is now coming through. So I don't know if that connects with some of you here, but let's go with this for just a little bit. So as we innovate anything that's human-made, technology, other tools, procedures, policies, we can no longer afford to privilege the formal simply because it's what we can see, nor simply because it is what persists between events in the form of plans, paperwork, and policies. So is that me ringing through or something? We don't know. We don't know. It's just somebody. It's alert. It's the hot phone. Okay. So the constructs of informality and formality here refer to both the roles that are assumed, so the emergency responders as the formal roles, and the members of the public as the informal responders. But it also refers to the nature of work. So an emergency responder can engage, and in fact does engage, in informal aspects of work, or what Kendra and Wachtendorf talk about as the improvisational nature of work, what Strauss talks about as the articulation work. And this thinking draws directly, of course, from Lucy Suchman's arguments around plans and situated actions. So in other words, what we think it takes to get work done, the rationalized plan, and the way we actually get work done, the situated action, are always different. And what happens is that social computing today exposes, or social media I should say, exposes the seam because it leaves behind the digital traces of the behaviors that people engage in, the communications they engage in that were previously ephemeral, right? So, and these digital traces reveal, and they make us see in part how informal aspects of human organization work gets done. And they become, furthermore, the means by which new forms of work gets done. So these digital traces create an opportunity for us to organize anew around the information that it leaves behind, or that it could leave behind. So, so what I'd like to do is draw your attention to how the informal aspects of emergency response have played out in all of history by just briefly looking at 3 different events before the advent of truly pervasive ICT, so that we can start asking the right connections about the new online phenomena that we see all the time in social media, and how people are behaving in self-organizing ways that we shouldn't be afraid of, right? Because we've always done this. So this is a classic photo of a boy being rescued in the aftermath of the BAM earthquake. And you can see just here alone how the formal roles and informal roles are coming together just through the dress, right? You can see the formal dress here of a responder in orange with gloves. Up here they're in camo with masks. And here, of course, these are clearly civilians, which is not an uncommon arrangement, especially in cases of structural collapse. Some of the best numbers in terms of successful recovery of people in structural collapse comes from citizens responding to the event, because it takes a long time for formal responders to get in. Very often people know where people are residing in a building that's collapsed, kind of, somewhere in this corner. They know that they're there, right? And so the very idea that people don't play a role in emergency response, we should be afraid of their contributions, is a strange one, because we depend on it quite a great deal in real response. So such understandings counteracts the myths of victimhood and false depictions of public conduct that Cloud Fisher, who is a sociologist of disaster, has so well documented. Victims can think and act in orderly ways, and that counteracts many prevailing myths and the movie version of disaster. There isn't actually as much looting as you see on TV, and if there is any at all, it's tiny, and it's not clear that people are perhaps getting diapers for their kid because there's no other way to get it, rather than stealing from a store. So just the way in which we think about how we cast the stories that we see in disaster, we must be very, very careful, as I know this group can understand, because if we believe that movie version, if we believe the easy kind of low-hanging fruit about how people behave in disaster, that they're panicked and not orderly like this, it makes it very hard for us to appreciate what's happening on the social media front. The waterborne evacuation in the wake of 9/11 is another illustrative instance of this, and again, Tricia Wachtendorf and James Kendra document this so well, where people converged to a lower Manhattan waterfront at Battery Park, and this is a photo taken from the point of view of the Coast Guard. And the reason that the photo is so grainy is because this was the quality of the air at the time if you remember. And they estimate that it was something like 400,000 people converged onto Battery Park, so a huge number of people. And they document, because they happen to be there, they document how a mix of watercraft, ferries, tugboats, pleasure craft, converged from all over New York Harbor in a self-organizing effort, never planned, never orchestrated, never communicated about, moving in and out of the harbor, docking, and moving people off the island. So this calls back to the famous Dunkirk evacuation of 1940, where nearly 340,000 Allied troops were evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk, France. And the stories are similar. Merchant marines, fishing boats, pleasure craft, big and small. You can see how these small craft are kind of moving the troops out to bigger craft that can't get as close to shore. And this is why it's called the Miracle of Dunkirk. And they did this over 5 days. And so this is another remarkable interweaving of rapid and effective formal and informal organization coming together. And this happens all the time in safety critical and mass convergence events. We just aren't always there to document them. And they're not always this big. So when we think about technology solutions, we want to expand our understanding to go beyond what formal responders alone need. We care about what we need, and we continue to care about what we need, and we do that in our research. But we want to perhaps include, so we might think about what are they worrying about in terms of situational awareness. Are you guys familiar with that term? It comes from aviation, it comes from military, right? Kind of having an idea of what's going on so you can figure out what to do and where you're going to put your resources, right? So emergency responders are always striving for situational awareness, an overview of the situation. But so might members of the public, so are members of the public, right? And we need to think about how they are also striving to figure out what to do. They are engaging in this intensified information search to narrow the gap of their uncertainty. And I like this photo because it sort of just visually it describes, I think, this very thing. So look at what they did here. This is taken from one of the very few walls in the Houston Astrodome. Because it's an Astrodome, there aren't supposed to be many walls, right? That's the whole point, is you can see what's going on. But and so they appropriated this little bit. This is actually a little entry into restrooms. But you can see this all over the whole of the region in different shelters. There were 111 shelters that stood up after Katrina and Rita in 2005. And they made a bulletin board for missing persons flyers. This is all missing persons data, and there's no photos because they didn't know they needed them. They didn't know they were going to be split up from their families. They didn't have smartphones, right? They had to leave quickly. They're just descriptions. So it's the best that they could do under the circumstances, but it makes the point that everyone is striving for situational awareness, right? Which is why when we fast forward 5 or 6 years, the distributed nature of digital communications seems so appealing. It's not tied to place, and it instead changes the audience. So this is a Google Earth representation of the tweets that came from this very small geographical area just in the wake of the earthquake. And actually a lot of the tweets, as you can see, are these person finder tweets, and that's the spit out, the tweet spit out of the Google person finder standard, the database that they created in the wake of the Haiti earthquake, actually. they used here. And though this, of course, is still an imperfect way to think about how we marry the cases of lost and found people, we can see that suddenly the problem becomes a different one, because now other people can now act and start figuring out where can these matches be. And so that kind of describes in a nutshell what the big shift is about. So how members of the public participate in disaster with digital support, that's new, but that they do it is not new, right? And this helps us escape from questions about and being stuck in dead ends around bad actors and bad information and this kind of stuff. We still have to worry about that stuff, but it shouldn't be our stopping ground. It shouldn't be what stops us from thinking about the potential and what is the richness of the behavior that is happening there. So social media is making this self-organizing behavior incredibly obvious, and that's the disruptive moment. So instead of thinking about this kind of artificial separation between what belongs to the formal and the informal, what we try to do instead is, from a place of this crisis informatics, from an objective place of research, is see how the informal and the formal come together at a place in which data and information and knowledge can come together. And my limited graphics abilities sort of still suggest some kind of divide, but I hope you understand that the circle is meant to kind of take that away. So that's the best I can do on that. So what we really want to do is see how a mass emergency can work as an information ecosystem, right? So have that be our scientific starting place, so we don't automatically privilege and come in with assumptions about the existing institutions and organizations around emergency management. And I focus here on mass emergency, and I think this is really important to make the distinction, because people will often ask me, well, how can this help with something that's highly localized, like a theft or a crime of violence? And it's not to say that those events aren't disastrous for those people who are experiencing them. They don't disrupt the social order of things, and so what we find is that the behaviors are not scalar, right? So how we deal with small emergencies is different than how we deal with mass emergencies. And in fact, disasters are disasters if they exceed the status of an emergency if we don't have enough resources to be able to respond to that event, right? That's when it becomes a disaster. We have to make really hard decisions about where those ambulances go. You have to make really hard decisions about where you're going to put people, for example. And so this is really around mass emergencies, and our work in particular tends to focus on emergencies that have exogenous agents or external agents, ones that can't be easily apprehended. So you can't apprehend a wildfire, you can't apprehend a hurricane, you can't even apprehend the terrorists of 9/11, because we're looking at the collective kind of response. And that's where I think the Boston bombing, which is a mass emergency and a disaster, the kinds of behaviors we see online there, I think, are different than the kinds of behaviors you see in these events with its external agent, because quickly the tenor of the conversation turns into matters of guilt and innocence and forensics and that kind of thing. When you're talking about these kinds of hazards, they don't go there right away, right? It's a different kind of information gap that people are trying to fill. I'm going to try to go a little slower, but I'm so worried about getting this all in that I'm racing a bit. So I'll go as far as the time allows. So I'd like to start now with these 5 branches, and I color-coded them with this, so you know where I am at any one stage, because I'll be moving through some quickly and some I'll dwell a little bit on, and then there's kind of some overlap between them as well. So first I'll talk about the issue of all of this with relation to the practice of emergency management. And there's a lot of work that we've done in this space. We're really committed to doing participant observation and participatory design of new tools and solutions for emergency management. And so I won't be able to talk about all of that, but I'll try to boil down what I think the big lesson in all of it is, which is that the changes in policy are coming about through changes in practice. So we can sit around the table all day long and try to imagine what should the policy be, but it always gets worked out in terms of the actual execution of an emergency, of a mass emergency. So I'm going to show you this in 4 easy tweets that occurred over 2.5 hours of how quickly such things can change, to make the point. So this is a set of tweets on the evening that Hurricane Sandy makes landfall, and it's between the Fire Department of New York, who is active online, and then some others. So the Fire Department of New York says, and this is exact text, please note, all caps, do not tweet emergency calls. Please call 911. If it's not an emergency, please call 311, and then some hashtags. Oh, and by the way, hashtags came about, were born out of disaster. So the first time we saw hashtags were in the 2007 Southern California wildfires. And we attribute Chris Messina as the person who invented the hashtag. And so it was all about trying to get signal in the noise. And we see, that's a running kind of story through all this too, is that there's a lot of innovation, human innovation, that happens in the face of disaster because people are really trying to close that uncertainty gap. Okay. So then somebody writes, named, I don't know how to pronounce it, DYNB, and he's writing exact to FDNY and says, my sister's family at this address, water is rising 12 feet, need help, this is the phone number, we've anonymized the data. First floor is drowned, kids scared. FDNY writes back, and this is not 45 minutes after the first tweet that I showed you here, and writes directly to him and says, please keep trying to call 911. I will try to reach dispatchers now. So, and then a little bit later, there's a bunch of other stuff happening at the same time. So a little after midnight, she's writing to a series of people that she's having conversations with and says, don't want New York City to rely on this as an alternative to 911, but notifying dispatchers of all emergencies tweeted, right? So this is just in a nutshell, the kind of large, what we're seeing happen on a large scale, right? That changes through policy will arise through practice, and if any one group will have any influence on practice, I think it will be probably the Fire Department of New York City. So, okay, so the second branch. So I'm just gonna leave that aside for now, and if you have more interest in that, we could talk a lot about the different kinds of things that are happening in that space and why it is that emergency managers are slow to adopt. It's not for reasons that would seem easy. It's actually quite a complex space of liability and justice and fairness that make it quite tricky for them to operate in a space perhaps as we might like them to do. So, but there's some interesting progress and solutions that are being worked out to kind of make it all viable. Okay, so branch 2 is where I think a lot of people enter this space who care about disasters, but maybe are coming from physics or a math background and doing social network modeling of how all this stuff is coming together. And a lot of the thinking goes to, with all this stuff that people are producing, can we derive information from it that would help us understand the situation and give us an overview of what's going on and a comprehensive one. Maybe later on we could learn about, how do people react and what their protective decisions were in response to evacuation orders, which is something I care a lot about. But when you're doing that, you're presuming that you're getting some kind of comprehensive representation. And if you're trying to do this real time, which is what emergency response would like us to be able to do, but we cannot do, because we can't do it yet. We haven't figured out how to do it. But to do real-time kind of comprehensive representation so you can save life and limb, right? So the stakes are super high. We can't quite do that. So, but real-time, we can derive data for a low false positive hit. So there are a few spaces in the emergency space where this is really useful. So one is for geotechnical reconnaissance and another one is for market surveys. So the idea is that we can get data real time. We don't know if it's representative, but we know that you're going to find what you need. And perhaps for some problems that would work, right? And it's not unfair that you're not serving some population that isn't tweeting, for example. So we had a chance to work with geotechnical engineers, civil engineers, and the Department of Transportation, the Colorado Department of Transportation, in the wake of the floods that we had last year in our area. I don't know if you saw that on the news, but multi-county region was affected by flooding from a 1,000-year rainstorm. That's the best we seem to be able to describe it. It was kind of unexpected and previously not natural. Over 4 days, we had a year's worth of rain in 4 days. And so the amount of water coming from the sky was just absolutely incredible. So we had a lot of flash flooding, and we were unprepared for this because the flood scenarios we have for our area are all flooding coming down the mountains. So I don't know if you know Boulder, it's at the base of the mountains, and as are several other townships and cities. And so the flood idea, this flood scenario that we were prepared for as a region is flooding from down the mountains and rushing through the rivers and creeks and other waterways, and then flooding the floodplains. Well, we had water coming from everywhere. And so we had flash flooding everywhere. This is one of the creeks in our area, or actually it's one of the bike paths in our area, and the creek is next to it. But it's this kind of damage assessment that's really valuable that you need to know about pretty quickly, but you need to know about it a step after you've saved people that need to be saved, right? So we can be a little slower on that, which is what we need now in terms of our science. It's also a place where if we don't get our science exactly right, we can be wrong, right? But we can't be wrong if we're trying to save people, right? We can't be wrong about that. So so people ask, well, how can you test solutions in disasters ethically? Well, this is one way you can do it, is looking at problems that perhaps can have some delay on them. So this is really totally opportunistic. This is a map of downtown Boulder, but we did this for the whole region. We can overlay tweet data that has imagery, videos and photographs, with existing floodplains, and we overlaid that with some satellite imagery, although we couldn't get a lot because the area was so overcast for so long. And we tried to think about, we were supporting a geo-reconnaissance team that mobilizes on the ground with remote intelligence about where to go and how to get there in order to do good measures of damage assessment relative to the hazard load. So, civil engineers build buildings and knock them down, and then try to figure out, like, are these good building codes and are these the right kinds of ways to structure buildings? When they also really want naturalistic data. And so the way they're starting to do that, it's kind of a new thing from what I understand in the civil engineering world, is they have an NSF-funded global network of geotechnical scientists that deploy to different disasters around the world immediately to measure things like liquefaction, so how soils turn into liquid in relation to earthquakes. There's a lot of that around here, right? And they look at floods and and tornadoes and things. And so we're trying to make their work really effective, as well as support damage assessment before all of it gets corrected. So that's one way in which we're looking at it opportunistically. But a lot of people in this space want to try to work in the area of situational awareness, and this really goes to things like machine learning and supervised machine learning, which we're doing with some natural language processing techniques with Martha and Jim. We're trying out some topic modeling. A lot of it goes to human computation. So when those first three things fail us, or it's taking a long time to mark up the tweets to be able to run through a machine classifier, in the meantime, maybe you can have, instead of having people mark up tweets, maybe you can have them make judgments about, is this tweet a good tweet or is it not a good tweet? And so you see some efforts out there around human computation, which I'm a little critical of. And here is, the story I'm about to tell now will eventually lead up to that. But first let me show you the world's most perfect tweet, okay? And why, if we only had all tweets like this, we would be okay. But in the meantime, we have mountains and mountains of data that we have to find ways of filtering through it. And our filtering decisions aren't always, we don't know if they're good. I mean, and it's because it's changing all the time. The way in which people create their tweets are changing all the time. So here's like the world's most perfect tweet. So this is Jane Twitterer, and we have a timestamps. She tweets this in response to the Red River floods of 2009. The Red River runs from the North Dakota, northerly. It's a northerly running river, which means they have problems with spring thaw and flooding all the way up through into Canada. And she provides a photo, and here it is. And then she tells us where it's taken. And she says, this is the river in Winnipeg, north of the University of Manitoba. She's trying to get all fit, of course, so everything's abbreviated, behind the law building and University College. So I don't think back in 2009 we could easily geotag tweets. In fact, I'm almost sure we couldn't. But she's providing the language equivalent of a pretty precise location. And then for all you linguists out there, why does this delight me so? So she puts the date here, taken April 8th, 2009, which is the same date as the timestamp. So why does that change this so significantly, would you think? Any ideas?
Because it can rapidly change, so like she could have taken the day before or the day after.
Yeah, she could have taken it the day before. This could be spread after, it could be retweeted. So she knows she has an audience, and she's acting from the point of view of supplying data, right? She's giving us all possible parameters around this very thing. So she's time-stamping it independent of when she happens to tweet it, right? So if we had a lot of this, we'd be great. We could do these maps and we would know what we were doing. But we don't. We have tweets. This is actually pretty good. We could actually do a lot if all the tweets were like this too, but they're also not like this. This is a little more ambiguous, but two people are talking to each other, and one is saying, I just came here from Fargo, roads weren't icy, no water in the median, water is in the ditches. So we don't know where here is, but maybe we can figure it out by looking at where she said something before, right? We can make some inference, and it's still pretty good data. The problem is this is also not what tweets look like. Tweets look like what I'm about to show you next, which the only thing I'm not showing you in this tweet is the name of the person and the timestamp. So you have to trust me. I know for other reasons that this is about Hurricane Sandy, okay? So this is about Hurricane Sandy, and this is the tweet I'm going to show you. So let's just hold that for a minute. I'm going to go back to this one, right? So we could be so dismissive of this, right? It actually has a lot of good data. And I'm going to show you next why we think that is. So this goes to branch 3, the collection and sampling of big crisis data. So here's the big aha for the day. You take this home and you remember it. Social media is conversational. Okay, not a surprise, right? But so much data, and for research that's built in this space, treats each offering as though it's atomic, right? They're not treating it as conversational. And so you would never do that in real life, or at least you're not supposed to. Hear a passing conversation and try to make some big judgment or inference about what that person said when you had no idea what the context was or why they were saying it. Was it an exaggeration? Was it a truth? We don't know, right? You don't know, you need the context. So we go back to this tweet, and I will show you why it's relevant. But I'm also, in the meantime, going to show you why we have problems with tweets like this, which could be full of content, but that we throw out. So the first one is the expletive at the very front. So back when we were first dealing with the Haiti earthquake data, which had the biggest volume of data that we had ever seen, just enormous volumes of data. It was 800,000 users, I think, and 4 million tweets. Now with Sandy, we're up to 20 million tweets. The next event will be something even larger than that. And we and others were just trying to filter down the sample so we could have something to look at and try to get at information that could contribute to situational awareness. So that was the criteria. So we threw out tweets that had words like prayer or praying. Not that they wouldn't be interesting for somebody who wants to study religious response or phenomena, and other kinds of national and international sentiment, but for the purposes of looking for tactical information, we made that decision. And that comprises something like, I don't have the right exact numbers here, but something like 10% of the tweets. It's just huge. And so the thinking too was, well, if we take out all the tweets that have a swear word in them, it's likely that those tweets can't contribute to situational awareness. Just the odds are low. Well, we were terribly, terribly wrong, because when you look at the Hurricane Sandy stuff, some of the best stuff comes out of this kind of statement. So that's a bad idea. So we don't do that anymore. But you can see just how it complicates things. And of course, you can't take that literally, right? Right? And so that's not right. This is a problem because this is a properly spelled verb, but it's the wrong verb. And so Martha Palmer does verb analysis with what is it called? VerbNet, and we try to infer meaning from verbs and just try to isolate that as a way to build machine classifiers. Well, here we have a perfectly good verb, but it's the wrong verb, and then we have this phrase. And what you get when you get human computation tasks, or people are trying to code up these large amounts of data for making some predictions about whether they're helpful, is you get these kinds of questions. So I ask you, is that tweet on topic or off topic? Is it relevant? And is it truthful? And what would you say? It's binary choices on each of those things. That's what you get to do. Binary choices. Well, you don't know, right? You cannot know. because you don't know what that means. And so you probably would say it's not relevant, actually. But here we have more of this fellow's tweets. And these aren't all of them, but I just selected these just to show you the kinds of things that can happen. The pink tweet on the right is the one I want you to look at first, and it's meant to go kind of in some temporal order here. So the only time we catch this guy, that we capture his tweets when we're pulling keywords from the public API for Twitter, is when he hashtags Hurricane Sandy. We're also collecting on a number of other terms, place names, and not just hashtag items, but this is the only time we actually catch him. We don't collect on hurricane because that's too noisy. But this is the only time we catch him, when he writes directly to Governor Christie and asks, when is it safe, again, to head back home? And this is helpful. This could mean something, but there's no agency here. Like, we don't know if he's asking for a friend, because he's asking the governor, so it's a little strange. We don't know if he's asking about himself. We go back and we look at some of his tweets, and we see in the very beginning, and this is interesting to me because we want to study evacuation behaviors and how people come about making decisions and when they make that decision to go. And he does something that's very typical, but we see here that he is, he's not worried about this damn hurricane, right? So people are really overreacting about this damn hurricane. Okay, so if you got that tweet on its own, you would say that's relevant, and you would probably say this person isn't going to evacuate. Okay, but then you go and you see another tweet, and you see it in isolation, right? So you see here, I'm about to put my iPhone on the charger. So if that's all you saw, you couldn't say that was about the hurricane. You couldn't know that. Then we have our deer flying in the sky tweet, which maybe we're starting to think has something to do with weather, right? And then we go to the next one. I'm about to make something to eat before the power goes out. So that's a protective decision-making behavior, and we're starting to get that maybe he's staying where he is. But again, if you saw that alone, out of a slew of other 100,000 other tweets you're trying to code, you couldn't still judge that to be a part of the hurricane. Then we see this question, and at the very end he says, "It feels so great to be home, sigh." So we know then from this whole string that he did in fact leave. He was behaving in response to the threat of the hurricane. So what happens when we're doing this early collection, which itself is a sampling decision, if we collect on keywords, in this case, let's say it's just Hurricane Sandy, we get a whole string of these keywords, and they happen these different times, and then we see that different users are tweeting them, and we see that this user 3 tweeted 2 tweets, and we know about that, but we don't know anything about what he said before or after, if that's all we collect on. And the same with all these other folks, and this is just impressionistic. They're all saying things before or after that tells us something significant about, could enlighten what the pink tweets are, right? And then all these people are coming together, and then you can imagine that you have all this crossover in conversation, and that's where you see social structure emerge. And that's where you see some of the fascinating things around information diffusion and how people make decisions and how they influence each other, how they help each other if they're onlookers who are trying to help in an event. And you miss all that if all you collected were the keyword tweets, which is what a lot of the research does right now. And so the challenge here is really a big one, because the numbers start getting enormous. So it becomes this enormous computational challenge to deal with sampling properly in this space. So just an example from Hurricane Sandy, based on our keyword collection, and I think we had about 10 keywords, maybe 15, over a 3-week period, because we wanted to look at the recovery phase as well. So a couple days before, when we knew it was going to make landfall, and then in the 2 weeks after, which is how long you usually give like rescue activities. So 3 weeks, about 5 million Twitterers produced 22 million tweets just on the keyword collection alone. So you say, great, I'm going to do good sampling here. I'm going to go back and get all their tweets, because I want to know the before and after. That's going to be a really big number, because Twitter returns 3,200 tweets per person once I find them. So we won't do that. So we'll cheat, and we'll look for all the users who had at least one because you can do this in a highly urban area where they're tweeting a lot. You can't do this in Colorado because you don't get enough tweets. So you can go back and say, I want to find all the Twitterers who had at least one geotagged tweet in this large bounded area that was under effect. And so you find out that there are 92,000 of those, still a big number, and then you go get all their tweets, and now you're back up to 205 million tweets to look at. So if you want to look at this problem linguistically, even if you're using machine learning, I think it's pretty difficult. Those of you who are working in data science might find this not so difficult, but I think if you're trying to marry the sort of the network effects with what people are doing and saying underneath it, it becomes very hard to understand. And so you can't look at it linguistically because you've got to look across this string. And so this has radically changed how we do our work. We realized we were making the same error looking at it post by post, and now we treat a full text for analysis as somebody's whole tweet stream. And that is actually helping a lot, I think, in terms of the predictions that we can make, just by making that shift alone. So that's one thing that I encourage. And we're also looking at new techniques for data sampling. So we're looking at what people do rather than what they say. And by that I mean, for example, where we have geotagged information, which is less than 2% of all tweets, so it's not very much. But for a big event like Sandy, it becomes significant enough. And we start looking at their movement, and we start seeing, did they evacuate? And if they evacuated, which itself requires a model that's pretty hard to build, because it turns out when disasters happen, plenty of people can go about their lives as normal. They still go to work, they still go to school, and there can be very fine differences between where you are and where others are and what you do. So just by knowing that somebody moved doesn't predict evacuation. So we're really trying to build some intelligence behind places and kind of clean befores and clean afters by looking at their history before the disaster to see what those patterns would be. So the idea is that if you can find people by what they do, then you can attach what they say to it, and then perhaps you can start building machine classifiers that will then deal with data that's a little bit more amorphous and much larger. So that's all I'm going to say about that. One thing I'll say, as I get this question every time, is the worry about bad information. And this goes back to how I framed the whole thing at the very start, is that it's very appealing to try to find the bad piece of data or the bad actor, because that ruins the whole pot, right? And I say that it usually doesn't. And though it's a hard problem to find, quote, bad information, it's the easiest of the hard problems to solve in this space. So those people can be found pretty quickly. Maybe 3 hours is still too long. Maybe you want to find it in 1 minute. But quickly is a relative term here. People are really good at self-policing and finding out what information is good or bad. And I think we can probably look at a number of metrics to figure out, does this concur with other things, or where is it different, or where is it deviant? The biggest problems, the things that keep me up at night, are the hyperlocality and hypertemporality of data. So you can be in a catastrophe, and you can find that the information that's useful for you is different than the information that's useful for you. And you and I might just live 2 blocks apart, right? So our experience from the floods showed us that very much. The effects of one neighborhood, 1 block over, were very different than another. And the same thing with temporality. So data that could be perfectly good at one moment isn't good at the next. And I don't know how we're going to get around this problem right now. And this is something that we're starting to work on pretty deeply, is to discern between time and place how good some information is. Because your source can be accurate, the intention could be well-intentioned, right? But you don't know if the data applies to you. Okay. That comes in like every 10 minutes or so. It's weird.
The last one was 16 minutes ago.
16 minutes ago, you're timing it. Oh, good. Data guy. I like that. Okay, so.
And the one before that was 4 minutes.
Okay, so okay, so yeah, when you're up here, time collapses and you don't know what you're doing.
Informatics.
Okay. So this is a part. So I love all that stuff. I mean, I'm really invested in doing that. But what I really love is I want to do all that stuff to get at branch 4. This is kind of where my disciplinary home and interests are, is looking at the social structures that are within these social computing environments and how we can understand them. So I'm going to just briefly talk about the matter of information diffusion, because I know some people in this room are interested in that. It's not my particular personal area of expertise, but we are working in this area in our lab. And my former student, Kate Starbird, who's now at the University of Washington, is doing some great work on looking at error propagation in mass disruption events. And so I refer you to that. But in a paper that we just released this weekend, it's going to appear at CCW, and we take 14 tedious pages to come up with basically this bottom line, which is that locals are more likely to retweet locally specific information than global onlookers. That's kind of what you want to know, and it doesn't seem like a surprise, but this is really important, right? Because here you have this sea of information. You've got these people who are affected in New York and New Jersey coming online. They're trying to make sense of it. They're trying to filter it, and they are filtering it, and they are looking for the information that applies to them, and that's the stuff that they're orienting around. Those are the people that they're friending and developing networks with, right? And so that's one kind of social structure that we can see that emerges through the kind of information that they're diffusing. And there's lots of particulars about that. And you see difference about them doing that in the during phase of disaster versus the before or after. So it makes complete sense, but we didn't really have any verification of that kind of behavior before, right? Okay, that paper's now up on my website if you want to learn more about that. But I'd like to go back to this idea of people wanting to help. And I don't know if you've ever had an experience of being in a disaster or watching your hometown come under fire, or just being worried about the people of Haiti and wanting to do something. And so a lot of people, of course, will donate money, they'll donate blood, they donate blankets. Don't donate blankets. People don't usually need more blankets, and it becomes this huge logistical nightmare to deal with warehouses of blankets. So don't do that. So people are trying to find other ways of doing it. So here's the real space way in which people help. This is, and again, it's a blend of the formal and the informal. These are people in the Red River flood area creating sandbags to hold back the floodwaters. And we see people doing very similar things online around information tasks. And according to one of the people so we've been watching all this happening, we can describe some very elaborate information tasks. This is one person we interviewed that we were discovering was part of this elaborate but small network of 74 people who were doing these things in Haiti. And she says, and she types this out, that's why there are all these abbreviations. So she says, in the beginning, I worked alone. I started recognizing people who seemed to have good info, and we would support each other, we'd retweet each other, and we'd help to find information for each other. And they started making connections between needs and offers and coming up with new ways in which they could help the Haitian diaspora in Florida who were trying to help the people on the ground. So they were trying to make really close connections to those they could help directly. And so here's what she then says 8 days after the earthquake hits in Haiti. She says, I am stunned. We've gotten supplies in. We've saved people from the rubble. We've brought them doctors. We have best team. We are volunteers. And then they go on and start calling themselves volunteers. And we've documented that this is kind of an ethnographic analysis led by my student Kate Starbird, and we have 2 papers describing how this network of people came about. It's a story of emergence and structuration. We call upon Giddens to think about how structures go from formal to informal to formal. And actually they, 4 months, I think it was, 4 months after the event, they incorporated as a 401c called Humanity Road, and they now teach people how to crisis tweet around different disasters around the world. They curate information and create information products that are meant to be useful for people on the ground. So that's kind of one thing that happens. Another one I'm going to turn to, it's a very somber story, I'm so sorry, but I have to tell you it's all bad news when you're talking about disaster. And I don't mean to be funny and flip about that, but I mean it really is, like there's just all these examples around these devastating situations, but how people come to resolve them or make sense of them as a collective is I think the thing that's of import here. So I'm going to be talking about Virginia Tech next. Virginia Tech in 2007 had a mass shooting, if you recall. And in 2007, Facebook was around, but it was the domain of college students. So we weren't on it yet, unless you were a college student then, so maybe some of you were. And so you can imagine that for a campus to undergo such a trauma, I'll show how the series of things unfolded where they moved to Facebook to have discussions about what was going on, but they saw it as kind of a private place, because that was only where college students were, right? The rest of the world wasn't looking on then. And people might have actually adopted Facebook after that event. I wouldn't be surprised if a study were to show that correlation, actually. So here's a timeline. I'm going to give you an abbreviated version of how this is where the distributed cognition kind of view comes in, this distributed problem solving kind of idea comes in. This is a timeline of 8 hours over the course of the event. The 2 red events are when what turned out to be one shooter, but they didn't know that, came onto campus 2 times, okay? So this, even though this sounds, I told you, I study events where you can't apprehend the perpetrator, right? What we studied here was the uncertainty around all the rest of the campus about what was going on. And they didn't know they had they didn't know what they had, right? The way it unfolded, they didn't know what they had, and the students were unsure about what to do. And so that's the part that we looked at. So first thing in the morning, this is Monday morning, right? So a lot of people are still sleeping. The person comes on the campus and kills 2 people. At the time, the authorities responded and thought they had a murder-suicide. And this makes the news, and this is when it makes the news about here, and this is this time period between 8:30 and 10. We did a lot of field work as well as online studies to do all this. This is when the strong tie and safety welfare checks were happening between students and their families and staff and their families. But this is important because it's at this time that the shooter comes back on campus to a closed building, and kills 21 people. But of course, we don't know that till later. At the same time, after they've done all these safety and welfare checks, the students are receiving mail about to stay inside. There's a gunman, and to stay away from windows. So they're staying inside. Many of them are still in their dorm rooms because they haven't woken up yet, or they woke up because their parents called them. I'm not being flip about that. That's actually what happened. Their parents are calling them here around 8:30. And then, so if you're in your dorm room, you can't leave. What do? You go online, right? So they were using instant messenger to figure out who was in their weakly tied and vast social network that we have on college campuses, who was okay. And they were also trying to figure out what's going on. Have you heard? Do you know? Like, what do we have here? And they actually used the passive indicators to figure this out. So they used instant messaging to figure out, are my buddies, as we used to call them, are they online or not? And if they're online, you know instantly that they're all right. Right, they're all right. They're not in harm's way, right? You might be asking them what's going on, but it's a way of indicating who's okay. Then Virginia Tech again issues another message saying campus is closed, and it's even more definitive, stay inside. And so this is when the sort of anxiety starts to really heighten. And you see this I am okay, are you okay activity ensue. So this checking to see if people are okay becomes, I'm okay, are you all right? Have you heard about so-and-so? Do you know what's going on? They create 2 Facebook groups, which we think is the first 2 Facebook groups that we know of that had to do with disaster response in this kind of way. And one of them, the one at the bottom in particular, is very important because the name of the group is I'm Okay at VT. So they devised their own kind of case management system, and you see this a fair amount in disaster response. So if you become a member of that group, it used to be groups were a little bit different. You could more clearly see the membership. And so if you became a member, that was telling the world that you're okay, without having to make any other speech act or declaration that you're okay, right? So then at 12 o'clock, and you might remember this moment, it was just a devastating moment when Virginia Tech reveals that so far they knew that 21 people had been killed and 28 were injured. And this changes the space of what's happening online, on Facebook and elsewhere definitively. So you start seeing this distributed problem solving to identify the victims, because suddenly it's not just a couple people that you're worried about, which was already traumatic. It was, these numbers are large. Wait a minute, who have we not heard from, right? You can see how that would change the emotional relationship to the information from the I am okay, are you okay stuff. 2 hours later, Virginia Tech confirms that 32 people have been killed. This constrains the problem space. And so now all this momentum between reporting I am okay, are you okay, to problem solving around a very particular problem becomes very real. And we found, and there could have been more, but 5 places across the net, with I think 2 or 3 of them, 3 of them being on Facebook, this has been a little while now, where there were multiple lists of the 32 people they were trying to identify, which sounds cold-hearted, but it was so not cold-hearted. It was done very carefully. It was very good detective work with a great deal of grief around it, where they were trying to deduce based on what people were and were not saying if they were okay or not. No one list was complete, but across all the lists, all the names had been discovered before Virginia Tech was able to release the information because of forensics. And so this is a tragic example, but it's a contained one, but this is the kind of information tracking and work that you see online, and how the structures emerge through the communications themselves, right? That's kind of the final message. I will now show you a video that's a little more uplifting. And this is a video produced by crisis camps, which was a big movement in 2009, 2010, especially in the wake of Haiti, to try to figure out how can volunteer technology communities, VTCs, so people from Google and also just people who want to work on the weekend as coders, and how can they volunteer their time and do something in a different way. So I'll let them explain to you how they see themselves.
As a programmer, we can actually help the people in Haiti.
My name is Chad Cataccio, and I work with a group of volunteers. It's called Crisis Camp. We're really a community of disaster response and relief specialists. So we have firefighters here today, people from the UN working with us, from the Red Cross, and we've got people from Google, Yahoo. It's really a whole bunch of people who are really trying to build applications for this kind of situations.
The reason why I came, and I imagine the reason why a lot of other people came, is because it's a surprise, a happy surprise to think that as a hacker, as a coder, as a programmer, we can actually help the people in Haiti.
Our stated goals are to build a new base layer map for Port-au-Prince. Another is to coordinate all of the missing persons directories and applications into one application.
I'm on Twitter right now, and I set up an account from the Camp Crisis, and I'm finding other tweets about donations and how to help out, and just resending all of that information.
The reason I came down because I'm Haitian American, and it's a story that's very personal to my grandmother's brothers. Some of them are in Haiti right now. Stay home and watch CNN. I couldn't just do that for another day, or just look at the internet, or just give money. I felt like I need to volunteer and do something.
You know, you send your money and that's it. You know, you feel like you can't get on the plane, you can't help people lift up the rubble. So we have a set of skills here, and we're just trying to apply them, just like the urban rescue teams. They have a set of skills. They go, they can lift rocks, and they can find people. We can code in Google Maps and try to provide them a better way to find those people.
I don't know how to fix people, but I know how to fix computers. I know how to code. So if I can help people like live by doing that, I mean, fantastic.
Okay, so what you're seeing here is more of a sentiment and desire being expressed, perhaps, than functional products being produced to do exactly that that goal. But this was really the genesis, but you see a lot of interesting things coming out of this. You see almost a cottage industry of people trying to find new ways to volunteer through technology. The OpenStreetMap community has been, I think, quite effective in this area. This is the map they were talking about. The speaker talks about Google Maps. He actually, I think, means OpenStreetMap, where you can actually write to the database. OpenStreetMap is the wiki of maps, as they call themselves. This was Port-au-Prince in the OSM view before the earthquake, and this is what it looked like, if you can discern all that detail, 21 days. And that was 446 mappers, 83 of them being new to OSM, who were tracing roads and buildings based on donated imagery. And this just is a nice little video that shows how this was done over 3 weeks, and you could see how the work was distributed across the different features. So how 446 people coordinate their activities to do this is of great interest to us. That's the internal sociality of such groups, and how they're organizing themselves as a global network of remote people, remote workers, is, I think, a really great topic for computer-supported cooperative work. But it also connects to the last branch, which I'll just talk about very briefly. Does any of this connect to things that are on the ground? And sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. A student in my group, Robert Soden, who has extensive experience before he began his PhD with the World Bank, working in developing countries around building resilience, was trying to very deliberately do just that. So they had this map, and now what? And so the humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, which also incorporated after Haiti, so if you're looking at this from an organizational behavior point of view, it's fascinating to see what the emergence was like around these groups. So they also incorporated to then be able to serve communities to make the map meaningful and belong to those for whom the map was created. So they spent a great deal of time in Haiti, 18 months, creating a community of mappers in Haiti, and they're doing that in other places around the world too. So we're looking at from how that happens and how you can support such appropriation of technologies in ways that become useful to the people whom they represent. The last thing I'll mention is I talked about how hard it is to study online and offline events in disaster and how they happen. Well, because we had a disaster in our own area, we could finally do this and be in the right place at the right time to look at both. And so we just released an ethnographic paper about how a group of people who were not connected to each other except through a community of practice, they identify themselves as horse people, came together around to help over a multi-state region to help a rancher in Colorado, in the mountains of Colorado, move 38 of her marooned horses. You can actually be marooned on a mountain, believe it or not just an island. But if you don't have road access, you are technically marooned. So to move 38 horses off mountain down to 3 hours away to a temporary ranch. And this is a big deal because the people didn't know each other. And they brought trailers, 60 people brought trailers and their equipment and expertise and worked over the course of the day to move these prized horses down a mountain. So how they do that, how they accomplish that kind of moment to moment over the course of 3 weeks is one that I think is really interesting and that we write about. You can read more about that. I'm going to skip the rest of this in the interest of time. And then just summarize by saying that this one-way kind of mode of communication, of thinking that the communications belong from the formal and are communicated to us as members of the public was never a very good idea. It was never an accurate depiction of what really goes on. Instead, people are always working and communicating to help themselves. And so what's happened is that some of the derivation work thinks about how we can opportunistically derive that information to be used for tactical and strategic purposes in emergency management. That's one important branch. But really what's important is that we look at how the communications themselves have become the material by which people self-organize and create new groups that sometimes arise in really functional ways. And in some kind of way that I only approximated here, I think that's going to have an incredible impact on how we think about emergency management, generally speaking. And I hope that you can see that disasters are in fact are sites of a great deal of human creativity. And with each new disaster, we're seeing really pretty amazing phenomena that's enabled in part through the technology that people have access to. So thank you very much.